Welcome to Waystations and peace be upon you. My name is Rehan Khan, and this is the podcast where we discuss what does it mean to be human in the modern age. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Walead. And Dr. Walead, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Rehan? It's good to always collaborate with you and have a conversation.
Yeah, I'm doing very well. And we have a really interesting conversation today around walking with intention. And we'll share with the listeners a walk that you and I recently did of nearly 200 kilometers across a desert and rocky and mountain landscape, but more on that to come in just a minute. We're talking, as I say, about walking with intention. And if you look at sacred scriptures and you look at literary works that have come out of those sacred scriptures, they're often full of images of a path or of a passage or of kind of wandering or of kind of wayfaring. In the Quran, it often refers to a straight path, which can lead to the divine. In the Christian tradition, in the Gospel of John, it refers to Christ saying to, follow him, for you will not walk in darkness, but you will have the light. In the Buddhist tradition, there's a journey to wisdom through sort of an eightfold path of virtue. And many other traditions also speak about a path. Often the path is very narrow. Often the path is full of roadblocks. And sometimes those roadblocks are things like one's pride and overcoming those. And so likewise, people who've written about walking and journeys and paths, who are poets and writers, have also used walking as an allegory in the stories they want to tell. And even if you look at the kind of the popular culture fantasy epics like the Tolkien books, there's a lot of walking in Lord of the Rings. They're always walking over marshes or through mountains. So walking is used quite a lot in much fiction. And as I say, we both recently went on a walk with a larger group. But before we get to that, Dr. Willie, can I ask you then, really, as a scholar, as an educator, as someone who spends time with students and with other people, sharing knowledge, learning knowledge, I'm guessing a lot of that is done, in a sitting around and a bit more sedentary. But how do you actually bring things like walking with intention into your life and making it part of your life?
Thank you, Rehan. Barakallah fiqh. I think this is a topic we're looking to tackle about walking and maybe the idea of a sort of sanctity around it. Is not unique to the Muslim culture, obviously, and many other traditions, as you mentioned, have that. And it's true, I spend a lot of my time what seems to be in a sedentary position, but I am trying to alleviate that as much as I can. And so, since I was a child, I've always been into different sports and athletics, and my tennis exploits firsthand. But I also played football, soccer, and one of the things I like to do actually when I travel is to explore a city by walking, and especially if it has kind of a sort of urban aspect to it, just to get around there and walk. And I've walked the streets in Istanbul extensively, in Cairo, in Paris, in Brussels, in London, and different places. And to me, you get to really see, not just see with your eyes, but see with your heart when you have that kind of first person perspective on things. And it's interesting when you were talking about the different kind of threads there in different religions. And there's a particular verse in the Quran that came to mind when you were mentioning that says to the believers, have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and believe in his messenger, and he will give you two allotments of his mercy. And then he will give you a light by which to walk. نور تمشون به. So the word walk is actually mentioned in that verse. And to forgive your sins, and he's most forgiving, most merciful. So the commentators on that verse, the two allotments, they differ. What two allotments is that of mercy? Some said if you were believers in a sacred tradition before Islam, like Christianity or Judaism, and then you came to Islam, it could mean that. Others say it has a more general meaning. But what inspired me when I saw that is the idea of walking. Actually, there's a duality to it because you're taking step after step, right? One with the right, one with the left. And that seems to correspond to the idea of walking as if you're getting something from the right, something from the left, and the 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 human terrestrial universe is very much a dual one, right? The Quran mentions that everything has been created in pairs. So even we are the human body very much is like that: two eyes, two ears, two legs, 2 feet, and so forth. And even the word for man, for human being in Arabic, is rajul, which is a variation of rijl, which is a variation of foot or leg. So it's as if, and I think we are unique in that in the animal kingdom, that we walk upright on 2 feet. And so the very definition of human being is the one who walks. And even the walker is a very slight variation of that, rajil versus rajul, right? And Surah Al-Hajj talks about people coming to the Hajj, rijalan wa rukbana. Some people read that, they say you come as men and you come riding. No, it means you come walking and you come riding. So even the most sacred pilgrimage of all, at least in the Muslim tradition, which is the Hajj, people go walking. And the fuqaha, they say that, the Islamic scholars, that some of them, at least the Maliki school, says if you make a vow to walk to Mecca, then you have to walk it. And you can't take any other form of transportation, assuming that it's walkable, right? That you can walk there, that you don't have to cross an ocean, obviously. But let's say here in Dubai, for example, it's walkable. And if I make a vow that I'm going to walk to Mecca, then I actually have to fulfill that vow, I have to walk. I can't take any other mode of transportation. So there's kind of, that sanctity in it. So with students and so forth, I'm trying to incorporate more of a physical aspect and a movement aspect. And I think for many students, especially students of Islamic sciences, they tend not to be that active physically, and they tend to think that one has to devote kind of all of their life in the books. And I disagree with that assumption. I think if you look at the prophetic lifestyle, then the Prophet ﷺ walked often. Every day he walked, and probably along the lines of several kilometers a day, if not more than that. If we were to kind of do an in-depth study of how he went about his day, I think there was much walking. And then they talk about how if you live within a certain distance within the mosque, which really comes out to about a kilometer or less, then you should be, it's expected you should walk there, that you'll be able to walk there even up to 5 times a day. So if you think about that, if you're doing that, that's 5 and 2 kilometers, both, that's 10K in a day. If you live on the outskirts or you live on the edge of how far you should walk to a mosque, for example. And then walking is the least common denominator. It's the cheapest form of travel. Most people can do it if they're upright and they can, and they're physically able to, then they can walk. So I think it has a much greater bearing in Muslim tradition than people realize. And I try to incorporate as much as we can. Even to sometimes have experiences where you're just walking. You don't have to be talking, but even just, like we experience, and we'll talk about it a little bit, just walking and then experiencing what's out there. Alhamdulillah. So, but obviously you're a teacher and you teach at university, and there's a lot of screen time that's done there. How do you fit walking into your schedule?
Yeah, no, and I think I'd like to pick up on something you mentioned there, which is the fact that walking is very instinctive, and when you look at young children, when they're just growing up and they started to move, and then they really want to take that first step, those babies are getting to that point where they're standing up, and then they're just trying to take that first step. It's so instinctive. You can see they just know what they need to do. And of course, when they start taking that first step, that joy that parents kind of experience is like, oh, he's walking now. It's joyful. But then you suddenly realize your living room is not quite the way it should be, and you need to hide a bunch of stuff which is now within reach. But it's a
Not
crucial.
baby proof.
Yeah, baby proof it, exactly. But it's a crucial milestone for every child, and it's a crucial milestone for every parent as well, because it gives that child some level of independence. So it's very instinctive. And I know that I remember when I was 13 years old, I actually had an accident which meant that I had to uh, use crutches to walk for 6 months, and that's a long time to be in crutches for 6 months. But once after those 6 months finished, the elation I still remember very clearly taking the first step without crutches. And I can safely say it's probably the most joyful, momentous step I've ever taken in my life because suddenly I could walk again, you know? So it's that real instinctive feeling. So I think as bipeds, we are designed very much to walk and, not to sit around in offices in a very sedentary manner. And, we know that movement is important. And, sometimes if someone's feeling a little bit down or they're not feeling great and they go for a walk, they feel lighter. Suddenly that load gets lifted because that movement just kind of and it takes you away from that hustle of work and productivity. It just takes you away from that problem. So I- it's very ancient, it's very primordial, it's very kind of elemental. And I think the other thing that happens, of course, is when we walk. The question specifically, what you were asking me is, as a writer, how do I build this in? It's that sensory experience, right? Because suddenly you're walking out there in the majesty of the environment you're around. You're kind of shedding your egoic self because, especially if you're walking in nature, the animals, the insects, the trees, the mountains, they don't really know who you are. So you have no status. You're just very kind of like you're just there. I'm with all the other living creatures. So your kind of ego just gets shedded completely, and you could and you enjoy that kind of natural environment. So I think for writers particularly, being able to get out to walk, it makes you feel easy inside, and also I think it connects you to the cosmic, to the sensory that's around you as well.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I like what you said there. I find it interesting that it's an equalizer. I didn't quite think of it like that before. You do have no status, and even whatever you're wearing, and doesn't mean anything to the creatures that are, for the most part, anyway, unless you're wearing camouflage and you're trying to hunt something. But other than this, I think that's a very kind of interesting and important point. And you know, looking at it from a spiritual perspective, a lot of spiritual, let's say, from purification standpoint, is about shedding up the ego and putting the nafs, the ego, in its place. And then the idea then is that once you're able to do that, let's say effectively or successfully, then you will be at a higher level of unity, so to speak, and consciousness with everything else that's around you. So it's kind of your ego that separates you from that level of let's say, empathy and consciousness and really seeing things, out there. When we are so enamored with our ego and with our wants and our desires and what we think to be needs and so forth, then we don't really see anything else. It's very consuming. We've talked about this, but I ride horses a lot, and one of the things I notice about how the way the horse moves in the environment is it's very vigilant, right? It's a prey animal, and so it's always constant, especially if you're out by yourself. The interesting thing is if the horse is out with other horses, it kind of outsources the vigilant part to whatever horse is leading. And a lot of people don't realize that unless you've actually done it. So if you're not the lead horse and you're like 2, 3, 4 behind, and there's a horse behind you, it's kind of almost like autopilot because the horse feels comfortable. It doesn't have to do that much work, and it's just following the lead of the one in front of it. It's a completely different experience, depending upon the level of training of the horse and the rider, obviously. But if you're out there alone, then you begin to feel what the horse feels. The nod this way and looking that way, and you see a little plastic debris. And for you, it's nothing. But for some horses who don't have experience with it, it's like, what is that? And it'll actually jump away from that thing that it can't recognize or can't reconcile if it's a threat or not a threat. So there's always a constant threat assessment that's going on, especially a herd animal like a horse when it's out there by itself. When you watch those wildlife videos, the deer is, chomping down and looking up. Is there something around? Horses have no almost totally 360 awareness. Their ears can actually turn 180 degrees to the back. And that actually gives you where the horse's psyche is at, the function of its ears, and so forth. And so it's like, subhanAllah, like as if God, he, equipped us with, what we need exactly to function in our particular environments. And human beings don't have that kind of 360 awareness unless they're very well trained to be able to, to be aware of those things. So, but I think the more that you walk, then the more that you see, and that's kind of the constant theme that I kind of get when I walk different terrains and different places and different cities, or even when it's out in the wilderness, or it's out even in an urban environment. I think there's a lot that can be experienced by walking. And one of the things about the prophetic walk of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is that his walk was very purposeful, to the degree that the companions around him took time to describe it. They actually said, this is how he walked. And one of the descriptions of how he walked, amongst the descriptions, is that he was walking very intentionally. We couldn't catch up to him, is something they said too, even though it looked like he was walking at a normal pace. So their conclusion, it's as if the ground was moving for him, rather than he's making that, that stride and effort to kind of move fast. But he's the one that's walking with purpose, right? And kind of has a destination and where they're going, still vigilant of what's going on. And it said that most of the time when the way he would look downwards, not upwards, in humility. And sometimes he would look upwards as well. So it is an engagement of all the senses, I think. You can engage all the senses. And I think that's why people, they get a lift after they get up, they move around, and so forth. And being sedentary kind of is equated with being stagnant. There's a stagnation there. And you think about bodies of water, how they move. What happens to a body of water that's stagnant, that doesn't go anywhere, that doesn't flow? It could become poisonous or putrid, or at least stagnant and foul smelling and things like this. But when the water is moving, there's a sense of purity and ease and cleanliness and revivification that happens with the flowing thing. So be like the water and move.
Yeah, and so much of the human body is water itself as well, right? It needs to move.
Yeah,
it needs to flow.
That's right.
So, I think that's a really interesting point. What I'd like to then just now mention is the fact that you and I did go on this walk with about 25, 30 other people, and we're going to play a clip now, which hopefully explains to the listeners what we were doing. And this was something. It's a kind of a 4-minute clip, which came at the start of our journey. So let's hear the clip now. So I'm currently walking through the desert in Saudi Arabia on a hot and barren open plain surrounded by mountains. And you may be thinking, what exactly am I up to? Well, I've also got my co-host next to me, Dr. Walead Mosaad. And Dr. Walead, maybe you could just, as we walk through this hot plain, 30 degrees temperature with other group of people, just tell us, what exactly are we up to?
Thank you, Rehan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's a pleasure to be on this journey with you. So I know we haven't said what it is exactly, but we are trying to retrace the steps that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ took when he made his emigration, or his hijrah, from Mecca to Al-Medina. And the Prophet ﷺ was born and raised in Mecca, lived all his life there. He only left a few times on a couple of trading trips with his uncle as a young man, and then later as an older man on behalf of what was going to be his future wife, Khadija bint Khuwaylid. And when he started his mission, in the early years, it was surreptitious. It wasn't something everybody knew about. And it was only members of his household that were involved. But eventually, he was ordered by God to command, or to invite all of the people of Mecca to Islam. And this is when the difficulties started to happen. So eventually, after 13 years from the beginning of his mission, the Prophet ﷺ was given permission by God to emigrate to somewhere else. And that somewhere else was this place called Yathrib. And eventually it became known as Al-Medina, or Al-Medina Al-Munawwara, the illumined city, illumined with his light, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So, as he left Mecca, the Quraysh were very keen on stopping him from doing that, because they felt that if he went somewhere else and made allies with other tribes, then he would be even more difficult to stop after that. So they had searched for him. They put a bounty on his head and his companion of 100 camels each to bring them back to Mecca in whatever form before they made it to Medina. So we're tracing those steps right now. We're on day one, which is the first probably 40 or 50 kilos, maybe 80 kilos that the Prophet ﷺ walked on that day with his companion, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and also they had a guide, Abdullah ibn Urayqit, and they had Abu Bakr's servant with them also. So they made their way through this, what looks like to be a barren, vast desert, and we're part of the effort, our participants, to try to revive this idea of retracing those steps. And it is our intention, inshallah, to make it from here and eventually to Al-Medina in about 6 days' time, inshallah. We'll walk much of the path, not all of it. It's about 400 kilometers from here to Al-Medina, so we hope to cover maybe 20 to 30 kilometers per day walking, and the rest in vehicles, inshallah. And we're stopping at certain places where it is presumed or even well known that the Prophet ﷺ stopped and had some interaction with the local people he encountered on this particular route. So the significance of this, of hijrah, or immigration, is more about immigration of meaning, immigration of a heart, immigration to do something and to sacrifice solely for a higher cause, and in this case for God and His Prophet. And the prophetic narrations talking about immigration talk in this vein, that the Prophet ﷺ emigrated for Allah, and then those who emigrated to Allah and His Prophet. So in essence, every believer can still have some allotment of this, even if they don't retrace the physical steps, but they can try to take the meaningful steps. And in one of the prophetic narrations, the Prophet ﷺ said, the true emigrant is the one who emigrates from a lower consciousness and from their mistakes to a higher consciousness and to a higher level of compliance and obedience to the commands of God and His Prophet. So as you can see, we're walking, and maybe we're starting to get out of breath, but the journey is the destination, as they say, and I think we're enjoying it as we're moving along. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you, Dr. Walead. Yeah, it's day one, and the group is very diverse with people who are in their sort of early 20s all the way up to people who are touching 70, and so it's quite an arduous journey, I think, for all of us, but everyone's has good camaraderie, and as we set off on day one. So, Dr. Walead, it's been a few weeks now since we returned from the walk, and after hearing that clip, which was our kind of exertions near the start of the walk, and I remember when we were setting off, we had a huge, vast desert expanse before us. What comes to your mind now at kind of regarding that start of that journey?
Yeah, thank you, Rehan. Yeah, we were on that together, so we did this with, as you mentioned, 25, 30 other people, so there was that element of companionship also doing this together, and the vastness of the terrain that we were at that particular moment, as I recall, was probably not an everyday occurrence that you get exposed to. Most people who live in an urban environment or like in a built-up environment don't really see literally for kilometers in either direction just openness, and you think there's kind of a vastness and emptiness. But then when you start walking it to some degree, it's not as empty as you thought it was. And there are things to be seen. There are creatures that lurk there. And there's the wind, there's the sounds, there's the way that little things in the air can be carried, little specks of dust mites and things like this that you weren't maybe previously privy to and not paying attention to, at least, right? So you begin to pay more attention to the detail. One of the hallmarks of what they call pre-Islamic Arabian poetry, which was the Arabs of the peninsula before Islam were renowned in that, and even after Islam, they continued to write their poetry. But one of the things that they were renowned for is their ability to describe what people thought was nothingness. And in very vivid descriptions. And, that's why the cliche, which is true, that they have 100 different words for the camel and 100 different words for the rain, depending upon, is it a heavy rain? Is it a light rain? Is it rain that happened at night? Is it a rain that happened in the afternoon? Was it a heavy rain then followed by the slight rain after? Then that has a different name, and so forth. And the winds also, depending on which direction that they came from and how strong that they were. And, even they say in the Quran, there's rih and riyah. right? And the riyah would be winds of mercy, and the riyah would be wind of torment. And so those subtleties in the language, for example, came very much out of their environment. And so when we were there, you would think, oh, this is desert. There's nothing here. What can we describe? But then it makes you pay more attention to detail, right? Where let's say if you were in, I don't know, Sherwood Forest or something like that, there's so much going on and so much green and animals and shrubbery and leaves. And so maybe it's too overwhelming to kind of describe in fine detail. But I think because of the paucity of what's there in the desert, they took a kind of a fine instrument to describing everything that was possibly there. So there's this kind of totality of the experience that some people may feel when they're walking out in the desert. And then you think about, I'm just this like small piece of that, looking at this vastness. So you become part of the landscape rather than you're the star of the show. You're the one who's a witness to the show, and you're not the star of the show. And again, that has repercussions for the ego, right? Because the whole idea is to kind of not always think you have to be the star of the show and you're the one who's doing everything and that sort of thing. And then finally, I think you realize that this thing is alive. The land is alive. The desert is alive. You look up to the sky. And we had some of those nights too when we looked up and we can see all the stars. And like, you don't get a feeling that this is something that doesn't have a soul, right? You feel like everything has a soul. Everything's alive. As the Quran mentions, everything is singing the praises of God in its own way, except in a manner perhaps that we don't understand. But you can at least recognize that they're doing that, right? And so I think it was for me kind of a very spiritual experience, on par with any other spiritual experience I may have had in the past. So how about you? How did you feel about it?
Yeah, no, and I think it's one thing you just said there, which is around comparing it to a forest, because when you walk in a forest, you have that kind of canopy over you. And often, great forest walks around looking at how the sunbeam is breaking through the tree line and then illuminating part of the forest or shining a light on it, right? Or how the rain is coming through the canopy of trees. So it's almost like you're in a canopy and you're observing some of the external heavenly bodies breaking through into the canopy. Whereas when we were there in that vast emptiness of desert, there was no canopy. It was just sky above, ground below, and you really, as you say, had to look with this very keen eye to observe. And I think it's one of those things there where what I felt was that as the journey progressed for me, I became more observant of the things around me because I became more comfortable with the environment. Whereas initially I was just trying to keep my feet and not fall over and not crash into something or, just, but the more I walked, the more comfortable I became. And then the more observant I became as well. So I think that was something which I reflected in terms of my own ability to take things in. Now, I remember at that moment when we were setting off, the Quranic instruction around tread lightly on the earth. Really, I think I do feel it came to my mind at the time because it was around that sort of gentle kind of wayfaring of being aware of the environment, understanding the importance of limits, right? To tread lightly. And of course, you can interpret that verse in many ways today. Tread lightly could be, well, how much energy am I using? How much water am I using? Or am I enthralled with sort of materialistic kind of excess? And am I stripping the natural environment, or am I being kind of a steward, where I'm showing gentleness to the creatures, to the environment around me? So I guess in that way, as we set off at that point, walking with that intentionality, it was kind of like we're doing this as almost as a worship as well, because we're walking with intention. Whereas often when you're walking around the city, you're off to a client meeting or you're just off to get a coffee, and you see people sometimes they're walking and they kind of plug their headphones in, right? And they kind of zone out of the environment. And sometimes you see that behavior when they go for a nature walk, they plug their headphones in and they kind of zone out from the environment. And so they're not looking at the signs all around them. And so in that moment, I remember I just felt really, really tuned to the signs around me because I was walking with that intentionality. Yeah.
MashaAllah. Yeah. I mean, it was similar to experiences I had in other walks that I've done out in different environments. And I think the common thread through all of them is to, as you said, tread lightly and blend in with the landscape. What was the thing that they were saying? Leave no trace, walk with grace, leave no trace. So, you want to leave it in the same state as when you first encountered it, and that's kind of one of I think, the mantras of or the etiquettes of these sorts of walks. And I think that's actually an etiquette for anything that you deal with. And you find that within the Islamic tradition that anything you encounter, whether a person or an ant or the sidewalk or the pavement, that you leave it in the same state or in a better state than when you first originally encountered it, right? And hence the prophetic ethos of planting trees. And there's a concept in fiqh called Ihya al-Mawad, which is to give life to a land that doesn't have life. In other words, to grow things on it, and then you have certain legal rights to it once you're able to do that, once you to bring it back to life, so to speak. So there's always this encouragement for the cultivation of land, or to beautify it, or to grow things. And that's another thing that we could really think about is things grow out of the land, which is, we take it for granted, but that's kind of amazing thing. You add a little rain and water to it, and depending upon the soil and what seeds are there, then when you have pollination and cross pollination, and that has to take place, and how the bees contributed to that, and the whole ecosystem, it's quite an amazing thing. And I think people who don't value the ecosystem, maybe they never really walked through it and looked at it for what it is. And that's kind of the tension you find with people who want to develop land, right? And it's kind of odd that we use the word develop, and we're talking about actually destroying the ecosystem and putting something man-made there. And then we said we developed it, as if it was not developed beforehand, or not worthy of being left as is, as if that didn't have some intrinsic value to it. And I think walking through the land, shows you that and gives you a different perspective. And obviously, people have developed land in the past, and we've cut down trees, and we've made things out of wood. But the whole sustainability kind of conversation is probably for another time. But I think just to emphasize the point that when we're walking amongst these living things, the trees and the soil and the sand and the animals, and even in the Quran, Solomon, when his army was entering into the Queen of Sheba's, or was going into Queen of Sheba's realm, and the ant spoke to the other ants. The Quran says, وَقَالَتْ نَمْلَةٌ. The ant said to the other ants, go inside your burrows, because the army of Solomon might tread over you. And then Solomon, Sulaiman alayhi salam, had the ability to hear what they were saying. So, and he's treading softly, on the earth, even though he's commanding an army, a king's army, as it were. So, I think we as single individuals, I think we can, at the very least, not disturb the things that have every right to be there as much as we do.
Yeah. No, thanks. Okay, so we have. So I think we then spent a few days in the desert, walking, leaving the boundaries of the blessed city of Mecca, and the landscape started to change. We could see that just maybe 2-3 weeks ago, there was a lot more greenery because it had rained quite a lot. And we saw the remnants of the grasses that had sort of grown very quickly in this desert landscape, where you think there's no life, but actually there was a lot of grass, and probably a few weeks earlier would have encountered a lot more green. And then we're going to play a second clip now, where we were kind of like halfway through. And I remember on this particular day, we had set off at about 4 o'clock in the morning, very early, and we'd walked by the stars. And so this clip that we're going to hear is basically us talking a little bit later in the day. So here's the second clip. Okay, Bismillah. Okay, Dr. Walead, we are on day 4 of our trek in Arabia. And this morning, we set off at about 4:30 a.m. The sun was rising about 7 a.m. And we spent about 2.5 hours walking in, well, at least 2 hours walking in near darkness, really.
Yes.
And, it was amazing because we were finding our way wayfaring through the stars and looking at the North Star and following a trajectory that was northwest or slightly of the North Star. And what really struck me was how the ancients, to orientate themselves within the universe, would always look up and out onto the horizon to see the majesty and to see their kind of place in the universe. Whereas modern people today, we tend to look down and narrow our vision very much into kind of devices. And and what really got me thinking was how much are we losing of that perspective, you know? So I think that was something that really struck me, that as we were being guided by our guide through the stars to go through. And then we stopped for the dawn prayer. And I remember we were praying in front of a gaff tree. And as we were praying, there was a beautiful harmony from these birds in the tree at the time, which again kind of was so elemental, so harmonic, and so in tune to sort of, you know, grounding us, rooting us almost in what we were doing. So, and then after that, we then got serious with some serious mountain climbing, which I must say was quite arduous. And I think we ended up doing about 15 kilometers through a mountain pass. But those were certainly some of my reflections from day 4 of this trip. And perhaps I can ask you, you know, what your reflections were from this 4th day.
Yes, sure. Bismillah. I think, you know, the greater context of what we're doing here is retracing the steps of a emigration route. When the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ emigrated from Mecca to Medina over the span of roughly 2 weeks. And we're kind of doing retracing those steps, much of it on foot, some of it via vehicle. But the thing that strikes me is the constancy of the things that still remain the same today. You know, all the things that have developed and things that are changing. And you mentioned the North Star and finding the North Star and navigating by the stars, and then inevitably at dawn certain animals begin to get more active, specifically birds. You know, that's something that really obviously hasn't changed in a millennia, and that's an amazing thing, and people are still using that as an anchor point, literally and figuratively, right, to make their way through life. And I think, as we talk about in the greater context of our podcast of making your way through or wayfaring through modern life, I think one of the things we're missing is these anchor points, you know, to kind of ground you. And you know, they say, as above is below. So those same stars we're looking at, and the same sun, and the same moon, and that same mountain that's behind us that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ passed through himself, still there in very much the same way. And we're missing a lot of that, and we tend to conflate novelty with excitement and with creativity and so forth. And obviously having something new and novel and never done before has its merits, but I think retracing the steps of what someone else has done, especially if it's been sacralized, if it's been sacred, your experience will not necessarily mirror the experience of those who came before. You'll have your own experience, but in a sense you're treading on something that's tried and proven. And by doing so, you will avail yourself also of what they got out of it, or something similar to that. So it's been really interesting to do this with yourself, obviously, and the rest of the group, and making our way through the mountains and retracing those steps, and you know, trying to get some of that blessing and that sanctity that they went through, and walking at night, and you know, and dealing with morning sun and the afternoon sun. And it does have a grounding effect. It does have an effect of you do get tired and you do get a little bit depleted. But then when you come and make camp and then you think about it all, it seems much all worth it. So there's much to say about that, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts also about your expectations and what you found here, and what you think you're getting out of it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of metaphor in the fact that we've ended up in an oasis where we're having a nice cup of coffee and we've just had a lovely meal as well. And so, you know, the notion of after hardship comes ease. And that's what as I was walking into the oasis, you know, haggard and tired, that's what was coming to my mind, certainly, at this stage. So, yeah, and, you know, we've got a bit more walking to do today as well. And certainly I'm looking forward to it. And obviously, I think we're trying to manage our steps
Yes.
a couple of guys over 50, we can manage a certain amount, but we know we have to be a little bit careful about that as well. Anything else you want to add just now?
No, I'm excited to complete the rest. And perhaps another point, just briefly, that I would make is the ground itself, having your feet on the ground and being in what seems to be a very natural environment. I think we tend sometimes to neglect what our bodies need in that sense. Today, when we think about physical wellness and so forth, we tend to focus on things that may be brought up by physicians and people now in the wellness industry, and usually it relates to sleep and digestion and these sorts of things. But there is an inextricable bond between the sacred and the physical, and I think your body needs that also. It needs to move into, and we've had conversations about sacred spaces before, but how about moving between sacred spaces, or the space itself that you're moving through is in a sense sacred, and perhaps the movement itself sanctifies the place. You know, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ wasn't the first person to emigrate somewhere. Moses and the Exodus out of Egypt into Sinai, and then eventually into Jordan, Transjordan, and the Promised Land, and other pilgrimages and exoduses and emigrations that have been done many times over. And obviously, in light of the modern world that we're living in now, with so many people seeking to leave where they're at for whatever reason, and finding themselves refugees somewhere else. And in a sense, you can say that this small prophetic community that lived over 1,500 years ago was a refugee community that found its way to a place that fully accepted them and took them in. And the Quran mentions that they love those who emigrate to them, right? Compared to, look at the rampant xenophobia we have, and people thinking that people who emigrate to them are a threat and are going to take something away of their way of life or their economic stability and these sorts of things. And the pre-modern world didn't really think in those terms. They thought that God's bounty was enough for everybody, and there was enough to go around, and things can be shared, and that you help your fellow man and people, especially when they're in a situation where they're seeking refuge. They're seeking something that they're not finding where they're coming from. So rather than just abruptly, sometimes violently sending them back, consider what their plight is, what their situation is. I mean, that's a lot to think about, but those are some of the things that are running through my mind as we're making our way, and I look forward to the rest of it, inshallah, and having more conversations with you.
Great. So, Dr. Walead, we just had that second clip, as I say, which is from about halfway on our journey. What else comes to your mind now that you've had time to reflect on what you said then, and just your thoughts after the event?
Well, thinking about what we said in the clip, and that we were retracing the path of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ during the Hijrah journey, the immigration journey from Mecca to Medina. There's kind of two main routes for walking. One, you kind of forge your own path, and maybe you may not be the first person to walk that way, but at least from your perspective, you might be the first person. Or, as we were doing, is trying to retrace the steps of someone else. And I think this is where the idea of pilgrimage and sacred pilgrimage comes in, to walk the path that others have walked, right? Which can be done both literally and metaphorically, figuratively. And I think that's kind of one of the main themes also of the Hijra route, that we were trying to immerse ourselves more in the metaphysical aspect of it, the metaphorical one of following the traces of who we believe, to be our prophet and our liege lord and our exemplar, and doing what he did. So retracing the physical steps in order so that we may also avail ourselves of something of the, of the beauty, of the majesty, the spirituality of that route that he took. And I think we felt that collectively, and maybe some individuals more than others depended, but we felt that collectively as we were walking this route, that this wasn't just any other desert route, that there was something specific and beautiful about this. And the idea of leaving something that was difficult and something that caused pain and torment behind, but at the same time loving that thing that you're leaving, but no longer being able to stay there. which is really the main impetus for anyone who emigrates from anywhere, right? Why do people leave their homes? Why do people go to somewhere else? Because the life in where they were was not tenable anymore or unsustainable, and so they're seeking, a better opportunity in greener pastures and so forth, or a fresh start, those sorts of things. So, there's the actual route itself, and then there's the destination that you're headed to. And even though it may be an uncertain destination, what do refugees do and immigrants when they leave? They don't know where they're going. They don't know how it's going to end up. But they have a hope that wherever they're going to end up is going to offer them something new and better than where they were before. And depending upon how their desperate their situation is, then they're willing to take the commensurate level of risk, depending upon how high they have that hope. And so, I was thinking about many people who emigrate from the African countries and they try to cross the Atlantic or the Mediterranean, and with very serious consequences. Many people losing their life in these makeshift type of boats that can't make it across hundreds of kilometers of ocean to the other side. But nonetheless, they try the trip anyway. And people who hide in the storage wheels of airliners, right, trying to get out where they're from, hoping that whatever they're going to find on the other side is going to be better. And that thought kind of carried with me as we were walking. And I don't know if the prophetic entourage knew that where they were going to was necessarily going to offer them all that they were hoping for. But as we said during the trip, it was an emigration to God and His Prophet more than it was to the city of Medina. So it's kind of hope based in faith, right? Maybe we can say that hope grounded in faith, that whatever's on the other side, that the divine alleviate your situation, take care of you once you get there. And so that kind of, I think that thought was carried with us as we were walking. And I think that during that particular clip, it was dark. And then we walked into, as sunrise came up, and we prayed the morning prayer, had some small refreshments, and then continued after that. I think that also there's a beauty to that. And we talked about the North Star, and this is the same star that was guiding millions of people or thousands of people before us, and they're so you also feel this connection with humanity, with tradition that's transhistorical, right? So you're not just connected to people of your time, but you can people who've walked that path before. And maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but I think when we got towards one of the days towards the end, our guide showed us some inscriptions on a rock that was made by people who lived maybe a couple hundred years after the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And they wrote their name and they said, this bears witness that I believe in God and Muhammad is his messenger, and I was here. And then we walked right past that point. Right. So we now have a connection with that person. We said his name, we mentioned his name, we know who they are. And so that gives us that connection. So it's not just a connection to, the creatures and the environment as you're living, but also the ones who've been there forever. How old are the rocks and the mountains that we walk by that also witnessed the journeys of so many people who walk that route, to continue to walk that route. So there's a sense of sohbah, right? In a sense, even if we walk that path alone, we become part of this community that also forged the same path. So to me, that was really a really beautiful and amazing part of the journey, that we became connected in that way. So what about you? What was your impression of that particular point?
Yeah, and I think, when you're talking about the inscriptions, and I remember elsewhere on the walk, maybe it was one of the earlier days, we walked through a kind of a wadi stroke, um, yeah, more like a wadi area, where there were some inscriptions from the Thamudic period. I remember looking at that, and that was, they were obviously a very early Arab tribe of much earlier period. And there were those inscriptions as well. And, looking at those, and, you see those elsewhere in other places as well. In Jordan, you see the Thamudic script as well. And again, it's like, what was the story of those people who put that there, and, what did they write and what did they put, and we're in the same place. So that connection to kind of a previous time. Um, but I think as we were that particular morning, as you say, we set off. We walked for a few hours in pitch black, and with just the stars to guide us, really. And I remember we were headed off in a kind of a northwest trajectory, but it was very slow going because it was very dark. we had these kind of lights in our head, but they were kind of red as well, so they didn't really project that much light out. What I found myself doing was going incredibly slowly because I was like either going to trip over a rock, stub my foot, or walk into a thorn bush, which I definitely did on several occasions. I can testify to that. And these thorn bushes are everywhere in the desert. So you kind of learn to almost like go much more slowly, much more kind of sustainably, really, in that kind of wayfaring. And as I was doing that, I remember thinking about almost thinking about things like business strategies and how organizations run their business. Is their approach to things like move fast and break things, like, because that's just reckless. If I moved faster, I'd probably break myself. Or is my approach much more slower, more thoughtful, more sustainable, but it's still progress, but it's much more slower and sustainable? And I remember thinking about that as I was kind of plodding along, gently, gradually falling to the back of the group, but still making my way. So I still felt like I was progressing, albeit slowly, but I still finished. So I was kind of okay with that. So I think that was something which really struck me on that particular day. And of course, we had some, as the clip says, we prayed in the morning, and the birds were kind of singing. They were doing what they do, and we were trying to also do what we are supposed to do as well. But one thing I wanted to ask you, because we mentioned intentionality a couple of times, and am I right in saying that intentionality in the Arabic would be like your irada, and your irada would one of the meanings of irada is searching for water. I don't know if that's something that you could maybe just develop as well a little bit.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
the same word as wird and wedded and so forth. And these alternative can mean things that inspire you or things that you're inspired to do, or that we are searching for the water source or the source of life and so forth. And so as not just human beings, but as living creatures, we're always going to have an eye on survival, and water is going to be at the top of the list. So the word irada kind of ties into that. The word niyya also sometimes used for intention. Um, but irada means, I would say niyya is more like intention, and then irada is more like intentionality,
Right.
the whole idea of it. To begin with, that you're doing things purposefully. And, we talked earlier about horses and other animals, and everything they do is very purposeful and intentional to survive. That's what's on their mind constantly, whether they're a prey animal or a predator. They have to think about survival and where the next meal is going to come from, and where the water is, and where are the grasslands that they can graze, and this sort of thing. And we've kind of become insulated from that a little bit, and our predecessors were less insulated, I think, and especially people who grew up in agrarian cultures, and as most of the world did before the Industrial Revolution. It was almost a totally agrarian economy worldwide, but we've become insulated from that. So I think it was important that we did this, and that we kind of reinitiated ourselves into our origins, and our, and with that, the whole idea of intentionality, and how were cities formed, and where do cities form? And cities always had to be next to water sources, and and also they thought about survival from external enemies. So sometimes they'd be surrounded by mountains. You look at Medina, where we're walking to; it's a very strategic place in terms of warding off enemies, because the three sides of the place is you can't cross by at least traditional means of camel or horse or walking, because it was very jagged lava rocks, and we saw that as we were walking, and then the terrain got increasingly more difficult. And one of the things we were thinking about is, how did they walk over this thing? Because we're wearing our you know very nice designer trail sneakers, shoes, and trainers and things. And what did they have? Maybe just a simple leather sandal or something. So it kind of makes you appreciate that insulation that we do have. But I think it's always good for people to kind of go back and not take things for granted, and see what's really, really important, and what's not. So
Yeah, and
I'll
I
leave
and I
that.
guess in a desert, especially in desert, water is life, really, isn't it? If the one who can help you find water you're going to follow them. And there are many, many stories of great people and prophets who led people physically and metaphorically to water, and so they were followed. So I think that's something that also to maybe just reflect on as well. Um, Okay, let's just play now. We've got this third clip, which kind of takes place nearly on the last day. I think we had one more day after this. And this third clip, we recorded it as we descended a mountain and got back down to an oasis. And I must say, it was a very arduous stay. It was very difficult. The wind was almost like a near gale force wind, and it was just, you literally couldn't hear the person next to you. It was just, ripping through and down the mountain as we were, staggering our way up it. And there is definitely some footage that people have taken. And if anyone has a chance to, on Instagram, maybe if they have a look at Hijra Hub, they'll see some of the footage on that. But yeah, and so let's just play this third clip, and then we can just add a few comments about that. So let's hear the clip now. Okay, Dr. Walead, we've just ascended a mountain of about 1,200 meters called Mountain Al-Azhar, next to Mount Al-Warqan, which is a mountain that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said was a blessed mountain. And I must say that going up the mountain was something really at my kind of peak. And I was, I guess I was just focusing on every step as we were going. The ascension was really high. The wind was just like a gale ripping down the mountain, and there are at least 3 or 4 times I thought I was going to, being blown off the mountain. And I didn't look too far up, and I didn't look too far back. And I just looked at the next step, and I guess that made me reflect that in life sometimes, we shouldn't be too outcome focused and thinking about where is this all, what's going to be the outcome of what I'm doing, but just focusing on the next step and then focusing on the next step. So that was one thing I really reflected on, having got to the top. And the second thing was the camaraderie of the people around me, because there were times I was really struggling and there was someone just said a good word. And, for them, it wasn't a big deal. But for me at that moment, when I felt like I can't go on, it was actually a really big deal. And I think that those small, kind words that people utter, I think was also something that made me think and reflect and ponder on as well. So I don't know what your reflections were as well.
Yes, thank you, Rehan. I felt the same. I mean, we're not as young as we used to be, but we made it up there somehow, alhamdulillah. And I was thinking about this. I was thinking, how many are the people who've done similar journeys to find refuge, to escape, to find sanctuary, and enemies in pursuit, and they have to go through these arduous journeys to get to the other side, and with their women, with their children, with their belongings, over maybe far more difficult circumstances and distances. And we had all of our trekking gear and so forth that made it a little easier, and we had water, and we had ample supplies with us. But the Prophet, for example, he went out and he only had so much supplies with him, and he had to find things on his route, including this path that we took here. And I recall when we got to the top, when we got to the other side, and we see this kind of big valley in front of us, there's quite a sense of not just accomplishment, but I think of somewhat of relief also, and that here we got to the other side of something that seemed quite difficult when you're in the process of it. And that also caused me to reflect about how sometimes we go through that narrow, difficult phase, and then on the other side of it, we find something that perhaps was even unexpected, and which even adds to the sense of gratitude and appreciation for the thing that you're able to get through, and then you find something beautiful on the other side. So such is life, and inshallah on this journey of ours we continue it that way, and all of the experiences that we find ourselves in as they are revealed to us. Alhamdulillah.
Great, I think that's a good note to finish on. Thank you. So as we've just heard, Dr. Walead, that was kind of towards the end of our walk, and we were kind of very tired at this point. And I don't know if there's anything you want to kind of add to on top of that clip that stuck in your memory, or that you've reflected on since then.
Well, obviously, I think that was the most challenging part of the walk. I think that mountain maybe was in the vicinity of 500 meters up or something like that. And
I had 1,200 meters on my watch as I was climbing it. We were
yeah, I had that too, but it didn't look like it was maybe 1,200 above sea level.
Above sea level, yeah, above sea level. I
Yeah,
wasn't
above
sure
sea
how.
level. So we were already
Yeah,
somewhat above sea level, and
of
then I
course, yeah,
think we trekked 500-600 meters up, and I think it took about 3 hours,
at least,
and
yeah, yeah.
it was laborious because it was a constant climb. There's a lot of loose rock, and you have to be careful where you put your foot. And we did need those trekking sticks. I think that were a big boon also to help us get up there. And again, I had this kind of similar feeling. How did they make their way up this? And not having the supplies or the equipment there. But once we got up there and we reached the top, and then it was like a completely different terrain. It's like you went from, in those science fiction movies, you went through like a portal, a time portal, and you wind up on the other side of the world or something. And it was kind of a valley, and it was green, and there was no wind, and it was quiet, and it was beautiful. I mean, we were walking down that way, and it was just a very lovely type of stroll that you would take in, any park in any urban area somewhere. But after what I think I made a joke that we were going up Mordor from Lord of the Rings, when it felt like, we're carrying the ring but anyway, so it was kind of arduous in that way. But uh, as I got closer to the top, I felt like, well, it's not that far. I mean, we're getting there and we're making our way steadily. So I think there's a good amount of patience that one learns when they're trying to do this particular thing. And literally everything in life is similar. It's kind of like a journey. There's going to be more narrow paths that are more difficult, that are more arduous, that they're going to be loose rock. You're going to have to find your way up there. It's not as easy to get up, but then you're going to find a place that's going to be a little bit easier, and then you'll feel that sense uh, of accomplishment or relief. Uh, you know, and the Arabs, they have a saying that said, "There's no real rest except after you go through something that's going to tire you." And modern generations have, I think, been largely deprived of that because we're expecting this ease and leniency and plentitude in everything because we've grown quite accustomed to it, and we don't know kind of what was it that got us there to begin with. And then you could draw on the theory of Ibn Khaldun in the Muqaddimah, and how civilizations come and go because people get used to ease, and then another group comes that didn't get used to ease, and they literally come from the mountains and the desert, and then they make their way to the urban centers, and then they become the leaders. And so it's kind of a natural theme that you find, but I think it's always good to be intentional. Again, that's the word intentional. Even though we find we talked about AI in previous sessions and the growing kind of theme of ease in many things, but to be grounded literally, right? To be out there and to not forget our origins and where we came from. And we came from the earth and we're returning to the earth. And those kind of things I was thinking about, at least now, after reflecting on our walk up the mountain. And then we were close to Medina at that point, and I think we had mentioned some of the talks over there that Medina is not so much a physical place as it's a spiritual paradigm more than a physical place. So the contrast between Mecca and Medina. Mecca, it wasn't the most ancient place of worship, at least according to Muslims, the first house of worship established by the very first man, by Adam and his wife Eve. And then later, reestablished by Abraham and Ishmael, or Ibrahim and Ismail. And then once again, reestablished by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's always been there. So it's kind of a renewal of that ancient place that is the connector between all of the prophets from Muhammad all the way to Adam alayhi salam. You contrast that with Medina, that had no such history in that sense. Right? It didn't really mean anything spiritually until the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ walks into it, till he gets there. And one of the companions, Anas ibn Malik, he said the day that the Prophet entered Medina, everything lit up, everything was illumined. Right? So he's what made Medina al-Medina. So then it becomes the spiritual roadmap for any other place in the world. For a viable community, you have to have a central place, even if we're talking beyond the Islamic tradition, but a central place of gathering, which would be the mosque, where people would see each other. You'd have an open and free market, which is one of the first things the Prophet also established, where anyone can come and no one is preferred over the other, and no monopolies and all that sort of thing. And to have akha bain al-ansar wal muhajirin, and then to be very accepting of people who want to emigrate there. whether they're refugees or for whatever reason, and that you get them a leg up and started. And that's what he did with the immigrants who had nothing. They left with literally the shirts on their back, and they come into Medina, and then the established people of Medina, they're the ones who opened their homes and shared with them their food and their livelihoods so that they can get started and they can start to make a life. So it shows you how all of that is, supposed to work when you are establishing a community or a city or whatever it's going to be afterwards, even an organization. So then Medina becomes the blueprint, becomes the roadmap. But you don't get to that roadmap until you come from that grounding in that ancient place, which is Mecca. And then you go from Mecca, then you have to do the journey to get there. And then once you get there, then you realize, oh, the journey was not all for naught, but it was something quite important. And in fact, the journey wasn't very much the destination to begin with. So it wasn't just taking you from point A to point B, but it is the destination. It is point B, as it were. And then the continuation of that is the establishment of the community, wherever it might be, whether it's physically in Arabia, in Medina, or it's in the UK, or it's in Europe, or it's in Southeast Asia, it doesn't matter. And you find that, especially Muslims, they establish the communities along these lines. Even walk into Cordoba, and I've been there once, and you cross that bridge over the river, and then you get to the center of the town. The center of the place is literally what they call the cathedral, but it was the ancient Cordoba mosque that was established by the Spanish Umayyad Caliph in the center of the city. And then you see how everything kind of revolves around that, and everything is built around it in kind of concentric circles, as it were. So where did they get that from? Or if you go to Konya, which very much resembles Medina, also a central place of gathering, of worship, and then things that come from, kind of revolve around that spherically. Just like, in a heliocentric universe, the sun is the center of the universe, and the planets have their interstellar orbits around the sun. So that was in Medina, establishing that centrality, that groundedness, that rootedness that is needed. And then also not neglecting the connection with what came before, with the ancient, which is Mecca. So, all of those things kind of came together when I was thinking about it as we were just getting up that mountain, and then we get, to the ease of the valley. So, I would be interesting to hear your thoughts also, Rehan.
Yeah, I think, I agree with everything you've said there. And that after that difficulty comes kind of the stage of ease, and the fact that the journey is the destination in terms of the journey makes you who you are meant to become. But I think, for me, a lot of, especially in that last clip, was the companionship, and was what you'd call the sohba, the group, the camaraderie, being with people. Because there was, I remember maybe 2 days before that, there was a moment where I got separated from the group. I ended up getting left behind for a particular reason. And then when I came back, I was like, oh, where's everyone gone? And the valley was completely empty. And there wasn't, all I could see was a mountain, and there's no one there. And I was like, oh, I think they went up this mountain. And so I started scrambling up the mountain, and there was a first initial ridge, and I was walking along that, and I couldn't see any footprints. And I thought, okay, I think they're on this mountain, but they're not on this ridge. So then I ended up climbing up to a higher ridge. I got to the higher ridge. I started walking along that. I couldn't see any footprints. And I was like, okay, this is now getting a little bit serious situation. I'm separated from the group. There's no phone signal whatsoever. And then I went up to the third ridge, and then I saw some footprints. I thought, okay, thank God they went along this route, So I started following that. But for about 10 minutes, I was kind of scrambling up this mountain with no visibility of anyone else whatsoever. And then fortunately, after about 10 minutes, one of the guides had been radioed by someone in a car to say, hey, you've left a guy behind. And he came kind of running back to collect me. And I must say, I haven't been as pleased to see someone for a very long time as I saw him.
I'm
when
sure.
I saw him. And so just being back with the community, not having to do it alone, right? That was hugely, it just gave me such a lift. And especially today, where if you look around, many parts, especially in the West, there's this huge loneliness epidemic. People are alone, right? And they're having to do everything by themselves. And it's not easy. It's not easy. And the knock-on effect in terms of their mental health, their physical health is enormous. And so I think that for me was a moment of reflection that if you have a community, whatever kind of community, it might be a community of people you do a sport with, maybe it might be a community that is a faith-based community. Maybe it's a community of people you play a board game with, whatever it might be. But when you have a community, it really amplifies your emotional, your physical, your mental well-being. Whereas when you're by yourself, which is unfortunately something that the modern individualistic sort of atomized society tries to almost encourage. It's your choice. You do everything by yourself. That's actually going to lead to a very dark and difficult place, and why make life more difficult for yourself? So I think that those are really some of my reflections listening to that, based on that incident I had, which thank God turned out okay. Okay. So any final reflections from you, Dr. Waleed, before we just maybe mention a couple of books perhaps that we could recommend related to perhaps walking or related to something that we've said?
Yeah, just to cap up, I think this has kind of renewed my vigor and interest in walking more often and walking more purposefully, and especially in kind of nature-bound environments where you have to be the observer and you have to be the one who's practicing the proper adab and etiquette with the things around you, to be more sensitive to that. Right. And a lot of us, we drive and we drive on motorways and small streets. And I think we don't have that sensitivity when we do that, because the automobile insulates you to some degree. So you feel like you are, this is my domain. And if someone encroaches upon that, then, we get troubled by that. And so the phenomenon of road rage and these sorts of things. But thinking about walking and how we're, the Quran, as you said, asks us to tread on the earth lightly. الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا. And then the next part of that, with أخاطبهم الجاهلون قالوا سلاما. And then the ones who act emotively, if they're going to get in their way and they're going to be emotive about it, they said salam, peace. So even if there's a conversation that can potentially build up, when you're out there, whether you're walking or you're driving or horseback, it doesn't matter. And you should not be confrontational, and you should just offer peace to people. Because one of the things is, when someone is taken outside of their environment, let's say you're getting from one place to point B, there's an inherent tension in that, right? You want to get to where you're going, and maybe you're in the middle of a rush and traffic is worse than you thought it would be. And so there's a higher level of tension with people like that. So we should recognize that. And I think walking at the pace that we did and taking things in, we have a kind of a nisab, in zakah, we say that, the requisite amount that you have to pay to charity, if you make that amount or you have that in your possession, then you should, I think now there's a responsibility upon us. We might have that in our possession collectively, that we've seen that. And so we should be paying the charity out and be more charitable to people as we encounter them and find them along our way. And hopefully I'm going to try and do my best to do that, inshallah. Alhamdulillah.
Great. I think that's a fantastic place to conclude the program. Any kind of any book recommendations from you this week at all? Anything that you can...
I mean, there's only one book I really thought about through all of this that I read a long time ago, Walden by Henry David Thoreau, which I think people have heard of before, by the American transcendentalist. He lived around Concord, Massachusetts. He was good friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Probably, I don't know if you in your British schooling you studied, but we studied those guys because it was very much part of the American experience. But, one of the things he wanted to do to get out there was kind of find some sort of inner truth and live a more simple life and get away from the materialism that he thought was in the town of Concord, Massachusetts, which was, we're talking, several hundred years ago, but he thought even back then that it was getting too much. And he was very self-reliant, and he logged, the things he encountered, and he talked about the plants and the insects. And, he would go to town periodically and check in with people, but he was very content with his books and with the natural environment. And he built himself a small cabin out in the woods. And this book has such a profound effect even now. that people look to that and see as kind of something emblematic of what I think to be maybe the beautiful part of the American spirit, right? That the willingness, to go out there and try something new and not really sure how it's gonna turn out, and to be self-reliant. I think that's one of the beautiful parts of that anyway, that I think kind of resonates a little bit with what we've been talking about here in the Hijra Walk to some degree. So
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
haven't read Walden, I would recommend that.
Yeah, I've read extracts of Walden, and it's one of the books I should have read probably, but I have read extracts, and I think it's from what I read, it's very much about not going out and conquering nature in a kind of Cartesian way, but actually being at one with nature, and so that you can become the better kind of version of yourself when you're there as well. Um, so it's something definitely I should read. I think the book I would probably recommend, I think there's only one book that comes to mind, which is The Fellowship of the Ring, which is the first of the Lord of the Rings books, really, by Tolkien, because the hobbits and all the other characters end up walking so much in the book. And the reason I'd recommend it is because of the language, because anyone who's read Tolkien, writers don't write at that level generally these days. The language is so evocative. It's so mesmerizing. I wish I could write to that level. I mean, I'm way, 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 way from that. But the language is just like having honey on your tongue, and it just kind of tastes so good when you read it. So there's a lot of walking in the Fellowship of the Ring. So that's probably my book recommendation for this week. Great.
Interesting.
Okay, Dr. Walead, thank you so much for your time. Always great to talk to you. And thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And thank you so much to our listeners for listening. And we look forward to connecting with you again on Way Stations.